G'day, how's it going? It is your mate, Failbait, coming at you with another Shadowverse 101 video, this time talking about tempo. So tempo is a term that has quite a few different meanings. It can relate to the idea of board presence and playing cards on an efficient curve, meaning that you use all of your play points effectively. It also relates to the pace of the game and how players use threats to dictate that pace. And so in games like Shadowverse and Magic, the Gathering or Hearthstone, it is also directly linked to your mana or your play points and the life resource. So for this video, I'll be discussing tempo in relation to creating a board presence while efficiently using your mana to threaten your opponent's life resource. And so I argue that tempo is best gained by generating threats on a curve while having potential answers in the same turn. And if this seems familiar to previous videos, because tempo works as an overall resource and is something that you fight over your opponent with rather than something you already have, such as lethal or minions on board. So in this example, I'll be using footage from the Japanese Open, where we see tempo being gained by the Forestcraft player pretty much from the start of the game, while conversely it's lost by the Dragoncraft player who sacrifices a lot of that early game tempo. Now, partly because of the way the decks are built. Forestcraft decks are built to have a consistent threat throughout the entire game. On the other hand, Dragoncraft decks are built to have late game power at the expense of early game tempo. So a little tip when building your decks, particularly if you want to establish tempo early on, have threats throughout turn 1 or at least turn 2 until turn 10. Now, let's get started. So, as we can see, the 2-drop was played on turn 2. There's no board on your opponent's side, so for turn 3 he plays the Starry Elf, which is a 2/2 threat, whilst also providing an answer in the form of the Amulet. As we can see here, the Dragoncraft player just plays the Blazing Breath, deals with the threat, but establishes no threat of their own. So they had the answer, but no threat. They lost tempo. Still an empty board. Here we see now the Forestcraft player opting to fill that board, set himself up with more threats, and play that answer in the Amulet as well, whilst chipping away at the face damage. Now here the Dragoncraft player has a few options. Again, they have a 5-craft now. They're on turn. They have 6 play points. But as we will see, again, they'll sacrifice that tempo now to deal with the threat. They value the late game power. So what they did was, they had the answer, but they've provided no threat of their own. Once again, losing tempo, and as we can see, there are 5 play points there that go completely unused by the Dragoncraft player. Essentially a pass turn, because even though they deal with the threat, they provide no threats of their own. On the other hand, here we have Forestcraft, who just drew a 5-drop Jungle Warden, and as we can see, the Jungle Warden does have that enhance effect on turn 10, but the Forestcraft player doesn't value that late game push. Instead, he values the tempo of this turn on turn 5 and opts to play the 5-drop, which also has Ward. So it's both a threat, but it's also a potential answer to any damage to the rest of his board or to his face. So that in itself is a great tempo play. It's both an answer and a threat in the same turn, and he also evolves it to make sure that it stays. Perhaps not always the case because the Dragoon Scyther is in the Dragon's hand. But again, chipping away at the face damage, and here we see another answer, but because it's destroyed, there's no threat on the board. And again, 4 play points unused by the Dragon player. On the other hand, here we have the Crystallia played on turn 6. Again, it's not best used for its fanfare effect, but it completely uses up the mana. It provides a 4/6 threat, again has Ward, so it's a potential answer. And here we will see now, at this stage, even though they have 8 play points, it's perhaps too late for the Dragon player to really gain tempo back. They will use their play points efficiently this time. They'll leave 1 behind. But because they just play their minions now on the curve, it's too late for them to really pose any sort of real threat. Because as we will see, the 2 minions will come down and there's no evolve. Why? Because the minions aren't strong enough to deal with the 4/6. So even though these are threats perhaps, they don't answer the threat on the opponent's board. And as a result, again, it's sort of just a waste of a turn. And so the Forestcraft player can get away with, again, providing himself with answers. So he drew into 1 answer in the Crystallia Lily, whilst also providing threats. So he deals with 1 threat, and then as we will see, deals with the next one. However, I'm slightly critical of this play. I think he could have evolved the Singer to deal with the Sybil and then attack with the 4 attack minion. because then it also means that it's now out of range of any damage. So I am quite critical of that play, because it did lose him some of the tempo there, as we saw, some of the board advantage, but because of how many cards in hand remains for the Forestcraft player, it means that he has all of these threats, has all of these answers. And so with that, I'd like to make my next point, and that is the more cards in hand, the more answers and threats you have. By the mid-game, you want to be able to do both, answer your opponent's board and threaten their life resource. Okay, the Dragoncraft player didn't do that, the Forestcraft player did. They provided threats, and they had the answers. And so as a result, they were able to have that consistency, have that consistent tempo, consistent board advantage, and consistent threat to his opponent's life resource. Meanwhile, the Dragoncraft player opted to build their late game presence at the expense of tempo. So what made tempo so effective here is that the more threats you can play consecutively, the more dangerous your board becomes. Knowing when to play for tempo, however, can be difficult, but the best way to do it is to analyze the board state. For example, is it an empty board or are there threats on the board? Are there cards in my opponent's hand? And what's my opponent's life resource? So as we saw throughout most of this game, the board state was empty, so the tempo was valuable because it provided a threat on the board. The other thing that also made it very effective was that the Dragoncraft player had very few cards in hand versus the Forestcraft player who had essentially a full hand. Now again, this comes back to deck building. While the Dragoncraft deck, like I said, can afford to have more late game power at the expense of early tempo, as we can see here, that late game power was punished, especially because the Dragoncraft player was valuing that late game power at expense of the tempo. Whereas the Forestcraft player, even though they perhaps weren't getting the most use out of their fanfare effects, out of their enhance effects, were still able to generate the advantage they needed in the mid to late game to ultimately go on and win that game. So that'll do it for tempo decks. I think for this reason, as we can see, Forestcraft is one of the best tempo decks, and Dragoncraft sacrifices tempo for that late game push. So hopefully this video has been of some use to you in regards to tempo, and make sure that you're not only beating your opponent, but you're keeping the beats of the tempo. Until next time, see you later.